So, it is April 18th, and the year is 1775. At the moment, I'm just going for a walk with a flintlock fowling piece, and little do we realize that things are afoot in Boston. General Gage is about to send 700 men into the countryside to go and confiscate the weapons of Concord and hopefully round up a couple of mutineers, traitors to the crown. And that is gonna kick things off in a fascinating way. This is the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and we're going to be talking about not all the military maneuvers, but some of the main key takeaways. So we're going to be looking at some of the weapons of the time, we're going to be showing some footage of reenactments, and we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into what made it so important. Because this isn't just the first battle in the war for American independence. This sets the tone and explains why we were successful at building ourselves a new nation. Now, welcome to, this is what the T.Rex armory, shop, and laboratory would have been like in, well, it's not exactly period correct to the 1770s, but it would have been a place where the colonists could come and have their weapons worked on, have their tools made, be prepared for the things that would have happened on April 19th. Now, in this video, we're not going to go over a lot of really specific troop movements and military history stuff of exactly how things went down, because there are other channels that have covered that really well and will continue to cover that well. And there are books that you should read, like Paul Revere's Ride. I recommend this book very highly, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the video. But the main thing that I want to talk about are some of the main lessons from Lexington and Concord as they apply to you. Apply to you today. But first, let's go back and let's think about the historical context, because what happens on April 19th and April 18th don't happen in a vacuum. There is a long lead up to what has been going on, because when General Gage's 700 men arrive in Concord to confiscate weapons and look for traitors, they find themselves met by 4,000 militiamen who are prepared, not just with their weapons, but they're prepared to do battle with the British Army. And that doesn't just happen overnight. Now, obviously, Paul Revere does take the message overnight. He has collected a lot of military intelligence over the course of days. But it's more than that. He has also built up networks of people over weeks and months. The amount of preparation that was necessary for the battles of Lexington and Concord to be successful for the American colonists was tremendous. That is one of the main points. They were ready in every sense of the word, and they were also morally right in what they were doing. These are some of the main points that I want to go into. And also, we should talk about some of the misunderstandings. We have misunderstandings today about what was going on, but General Gage and the King of England and Parliament had some other significant misunderstandings that they were kind of laboring under. I mentioned earlier that they were on the lookout for the traitors, John Hancock and Sam Adams. I believe that they fully believe that they were just gonna get a hold of these traitors, lock them up, send them back to England for trial, and then everything would just kind of blow over. The American people, without those rabble-rousers stirring things up, would just kind of fall back in line as good, obedient British subjects. And the fact is, when they showed up on the fields at Concord, when they retreated back to Boston and they were chased by men from other towns, I think that it dawned on them that they were facing not just people who had been stirred up by a few mutineers, They were facing a people who were committed and had conviction and were ready to fight for their towns and their neighbors. These were deeply held beliefs, not just the result of some recent political speeches. Now, we have some assumptions as well that are kind of wrong. A lot of us, I grew up thinking that the Americans won the war because we were just like better backwoods sniper marksman guys. We hid behind trees and we shot those stupid guys in their red coats that stood out in the open, and that is how things work.
Lord, make me fast and accurate.
And there was a little bit that happened in different parts of the country at different times of the war, but for the most part, you got to remember that the British, well, they had been fighting wars in the continent for some time. French and Indian War, they developed light infantry and ranging companies that would go out and had some significant guerrilla warfare capabilities and had developed those over time. But you also have to remember that the colonists had fought shoulder to shoulder with the British Army in those conflicts. They were used to regular warfare. There had been about 16 wars that American colonists had participated in from the beginnings of the colonies. And so these were guys who were not just farmers and squirrel hunters who decided to take on an army. These were people who had some significant combat capability, and that shows itself very quickly in the early stages of the war. These are not guys who just overnight decide that it's time to start shooting redcoats and pick up their rifles and shoot people for the first time. And their weapons were capable. This is my friend Elijah explaining his colonial era Fowler and comparing it to a military musket.
The only big difference between this, civilian hunting gun is really just some of the furnishings on it. So,
cosmetic features that the ATF would look down their nose at.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah. So one of the main differences, which can be gone around, is a lug for a bayonet.
Yes.
And
ATF very, very opposed to bayonet lugs.
The British were really upset about the New Englanders putting lugs, because they did. They put lugs on their guns. They furnished their weapons for bayonets. But that's really the only difference between that I can think of right now between like what made a military arm and a civilian arm. The difference wasn't too much, because this particular Fowler, it has the same bore size as a military gun. I wouldn't have this for like a hunting excursion, but for the military or for militias, you were required to have cartridges, which are basically just the total enclosure of what you need to load and fire.
This gives you speed, and the smooth bore means 4 rounds a minute in any weather.
Yes. That's like that's the peak of what you're shooting for, is like 4 rounds a minute in line of battle.
You know what makes a good soldier, Osler?
Yes, sir. The ability to fire off 3 rounds a minute in any weather, sir.
But these were proper firearms that were required to be had for militia musters.
Yes.
And so they knew their guns, they knew how to keep them in order, and they knew how to use them in actual combat against people, because they'd done it before.
There is a significant understanding of what is actually involved in going to war, and there has a very complicated system built around this. This is part of the reason that Paul Revere is so effective. Not only has he built his own spy networks and his own messenger services and his own networks of trust throughout these different towns, but there is a very complicated alarm and muster system developed by these towns as they have been engaged in these past 16 wars. This is why they are ready from a military perspective and an organizational perspective and a logistical perspective to engage in not only a successful military operation on April 19th, but immediately afterwards an ongoing set of struggles inside of Massachusetts that kicks off a very significant war. Second misunderstanding that we have around this time period is that it was clean and nice and just kind of happened in the front yards of the Minutemen. Stepped out of their doors, shot a couple redcoats, went back in for breakfast. And again, there's an element of truth to this things kicked off on Lexington Green and various other places right inside the towns, urban combat. And you can see that in some of the reenactments. This is never before seen historic footage from 15 years ago, long before T.Rex existed. David and I went up to Lexington to record the annual reenactment of the battles. And it's amazing how much of these historical towns are still almost exactly as they were 250 years ago, but they are now kind of hemmed in by parking lots and spectators, which kind of gives you the idea that the battles were fought in these nice parks and on well-manicured lawns at convenient times. But put yourselves back in the minds of the British regulars marching all night long to get to this place and discovering, to your dismay, that not only is your cover blown, but you are now outmatched by 4,000 men. So your 700 guys are outnumbered by 4,000 men who refuse to disperse. And when you fire on them, begin fighting back. And then, to make matters even more intimidating, by the time they escape back towards Boston, those 4,000 men have been joined by 16,000 others. So 20,000 men have decided that now is the time to push back against the regulars.
These militia companies, especially as hostilities were ramping up, you know, because they had many months advance notice that things were starting to get intense. They'd be training, they trained a little bit of marching and of proper battle order. They were made fun of it for it by the regular troops because they trained that a lot.
Yes.
But what the militias trained especially was proper loading from cartridges and firing fast.
Now, as we think about those 20,000 men who decided that this was the day that they would begin to fight the British government, we have to understand that they were not just militarily ready because of years and years of training as militia groups to do basically combat, like fight actual wars together as a community. This was not just marksmanship training. The militia training was large units operating together, moving and shooting and communicating. But there was something more than that. This doesn't just happen overnight where they decide that they're ready to oppose the British government. There is a level of understanding and conviction among the people that enables 20,000 men to go to battle with the British government together. And that is not just years of training, but decades of teaching and conversation on this subject and hearing sermons about these things. And also, remember that these towns are 100 to 150 years old. They have a long track record of governing themselves and defending themselves and working together and discussing these issues. That is why 20,000 men can go to war with the British government without John Hancock or Sam Adams technically leading the charge. The people were ready to go. And it isn't just a few offenses. Like one of the other misunderstandings that we have today is they were annoyed by a 2% tax on tea and they just decided to go murder a bunch of redcoats because it was time. There had been an ongoing conversation about this for some time. You got to remember that the situation had changed. 150 years ago, Massachusetts became a colony with the permission of the Crown. A bunch of Englishmen came over, they had the Mayflower Compact, and they built towns and governed themselves and set up their own forms of government and managed themselves. They did all of the hard work of this, and they built out their own defensive capability and defended each other throughout these wars. Meanwhile, in England, all sorts of stuff is going on. You've had the English Civil War, you've had Parliament rise in power, but Parliament has no legal relationship with the colonies over here. So when they start passing laws and they start creating taxes, the British people that live here in these colonies and consider themselves as subjects of the Crown, as Englishmen. That's another misunderstanding. Paul Revere did not say the British are coming. All of these men in Lexington and Concord consider themselves to be Englishmen with English rights under the Magna Carta, and English rights that they had signed these covenants with the king back 150 years ago. For Parliament to come in totally outside of their jurisdiction and put taxes on things and restrain things was something that was deeply problematic to them, not in an emotional way, but against their understanding of the actual law that they were governed by.
Be it enacted that for better regulating the government of Massachusetts, the present council is to be immediately disbanded. Be it enacted that Royal Army officers are authorized to quarter their troops among the citizenry. General Thomas Gage is hereby dispatched with 4 of our regiments to compel compliance with all these measures.
As there continued to be more tyrannical measures, as General Gage took over as the military governor of Boston, took control of the entire port, started putting his troops into homes, started to do all kinds of these sorts of things, there was more and more unrest and a greater and greater understanding of this being an unlawful set of actions. Parliament passed what they called the Coercive Acts and what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. These things were not tolerable because of an emotional state. These things were intolerable because of the laws that were on the books. And everything came to a head on April 19th because of a specific line that the British crossed, which was the confiscation of weapons from those militias. So these weapons are an incredibly important thing. There have been so many other injustices that are done, but this is, the way that we should look at this is not so much the colonists feeling like this is the last straw. Their level of frustration is up to here, and now they are angry enough to start shooting. It is more the level of injustice perpetrated by the British troops is up to here, and now they have crossed a line that should not be crossed. Remember, these town militias are legally formed. In fact, it is mandatory that you be a part of these militias if you live in the town. They are part of the town's civil defense mechanism required by law. So the British regulars coming in and confiscating the town's weapons, confiscating the town's supplies, is really, really bad. This is a bright line that cannot be crossed. And there's also the pragmatic component too. If you do not resist people taking your arms, you no longer have the opportunity to resist them ever again. So that is why the colonists were so ready at this point, after so many other intolerable acts, to begin shooting over this one. It is a complete attack on the legal system of the colonies. And General Gage is so far out of his jurisdiction to come and disarm the defense mechanisms of these towns. Some people have likened what is going on to a no-knock raid by the ATF against a person, but that is not the case. This would be more like the ATF showing up to disarm Tennessee's National Guard and Hickman County's Sheriff's Departments without any legitimate paperwork to do so. It flies in the face of all of the Hickman County and Tennessee constitutions to do that, and that is exactly what was happening in 1775. And remember that this is still 1775. We don't get a Declaration of Independence signed until the middle of 1776. This is 15 months before that. So what we have here is not two nations fighting with each other over turf. What we have here is a lesser magistrate, the Lexington and Concord militias, resisting the greater magistrate when he does something that is illegal and unlawful. It's not as clean as separate nations fighting each other. It is a very complicated, messy thing, but it is absolutely necessary. And the people understood that very clearly at the time.
Let it be known that British liberties are not the grants of princes or parliaments. That many of our rights are inherent and essential, agreed on as maxims and established as preliminaries even before Parliament existed. We have a right to them, derived from our Maker.
So obviously there is more to what was going on in April 19th than just the guns. That was the culmination of a lot of stuff. But I think that it is really important that that is how the war for American independence begins. Now, you might think it's not that big a deal, like every war has to start somewhere, but this is kind of a big deal. Not only were the colonists ready, militarily ready to resist, not only were they organized, not only were they informed, not only did they have the convictions, but they were right. They had the right legal case that Parliament couldn't just govern the British colonies of free Englishmen with rights under the Magna Carta and the common law and the different colonial compacts that they had signed with the king. They couldn't just be managed like these new Indian colonies that Parliament liked so much. They had significant legal rights to do the things that they did. And so resisting was the right thing to do. But doing the right thing is harder than it looks, because you have to do the right thing, but you also have to do it at the right time. And April 19th was the right time. There were provocations before, like the Boston Massacre, but they were not morally in the right during the Boston Massacre. That's why Paul Revere actually gave testimony on behalf of the defense of the British regulars, and John Adams defended them in court.
When people are taxed without representation, they are sometimes to feel abused. And sometimes they may even rebel. But we must take care, lest, borne away by a torrent of passion, we make shipwreck of conscience. Prisoners must be judged solely upon the evidence produced against them in court and by nothing else.
But April 19th was the right time. And then they also went about it in the right way, not slowly and quietly with the smallest number of troops, with overwhelming numbers, 20,000 men getting ready to stand up and defend, so that there would be overwhelming numbers ensuring the day. And then the other thing is going about it for the right reason. It wasn't just an emotional, obstinate independency. They had the legal paperwork on their side. They had a way to articulate their God-given rights. They were morally correct. That's why I believe the war for American independence went so well. They started off on the right foot, successfully setting the tone and the pattern for how they were going to resist unlawful authority, even though eventually it came to the point of making themselves a completely independent nation. So this is why the battle for Lexington and Concord is so important. This is why the issues behind and the issues after matter so much. And this is why there are a lot of lessons that we can take away from this particular day in history, even though a number of things, like technology, has moved on. The lessons still apply today, possibly now more than ever. So we are in the Axe and Anvil Forge today. I want to thank my friend Jordan Goodwin for letting us come and shoot in here. And technically this is not a 1775 era forge. You operate in a slightly later time period.
Well, the 18th century is definitely our favorite era to work in. We like making reproduction 18th century things, but we are just as in the spirit of blacksmiths of old, we are very much generalists to make all kinds of things. The history is what got us here in the first place, and black powder guns specifically. And I do love it whenever we can do something that's like a reproduction of something from the 18th century. So I do love the 18th century.
Yeah.
But
well, we've been friends not for quite that long, but it's coming up on 15 years now. So
it's been a minute.
We've known each other for ever since actually we went and shot that footage up in Lexington and Concord, and we've done a bunch of stuff together. We've not done any T.Rex stuff together, so
not directly.
I'm not sure why that hasn't happened. You've put me in touch with muzzle loading guys and collected a bunch of things and helped me workshop a ton of ideas, but I just realized we need to have you on the podcast to talk about some of the military history, troop movements, and tactics and procedures, because you have a lot of reenacting experience.
A little bit. Yeah.
And in, I would say, the borderline crazy guys who are really, really sticklers. You spend a lot of time with them. So, yeah.
I might be a stickler.
Yeah, we'll have to get you on the podcast. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you again, Jordan, for letting us shoot here, and for all the ways that you've contributed to the historical knowledge of laboratory, armory, etc.
Well, it's been an honor. I hope it's not the last time.
Not at all.
Ready?